Almost every single person, I think, feels like there's at least some form of verbal or emotional abuse.
Yes, even sometimes during podcasts that happens.
During podcast recording? Is that what we're saying?
That's what I'm saying,
You're saying I'm being verbally and emotionally abused?
I'm saying that sometimes you're mean to me. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Well, and I think that, this is a hard thing to define, and that's where the complexity of it comes in because, I have a pretty high tolerance, I think, of, people. I mean, I don't know, maybe you'd say I don't.
That's because you always respond with the same two words. One of them begins with F.
Now stop.
Yeah.
I do not. That is not nice. You're telling tales. But, I think this is a hard thing because part of it is perspective, right? Whether, what we think is verbally and emotionally abusive, the next person might not find verbally and emotionally abusive. And I think the big thing to understand in this topic is just because we feel that we're being verbally and emotionally abused doesn't necessarily mean that it meets the court's definition of it.
Here's what it does not include. When people break up, oftentimes, probably most of the time, they are fighting. And
Every time I've seen so far.
And I've been reading a lot. This seems to be a hot thing in the literature right now is gaslighting.
Right.
Gaslighting is something that's very painful, but probably not immediately actionable in court. Yelling and cussing, I would say I would give that a maybe. I've seen cases where restraining orders were granted based on yelling and cussing.
But it's got to be a really extreme aversion. I mean, one of the things that happens is, like with me, I'm in a 17-year marriage. Well, you can't sit and tolerate this behavior for 17 years and then get a divorce and go to the court and file and say, oh, I want a restraining order for this. Really? You lived in the same house with this and tolerated this for 17 years, and now suddenly you want the court to find it a problem.
Yeah.
And that's probably not going to happen.
Well, one of the things that can be a restraining order is if the yelling and cussing constitutes harassment, because harassment is definitely one of the things that's actionable in the statute.
Right.
And one of the things you can get a restraining order for is to keep you from being harassed. And harassment would mostly be in the post-separation context. And it would be repeated foul text messages or, repeated phone calls.
The other thing I think that happens is sometimes I think that this isn't real common, but we have seen situations where, honestly, if the one party doesn't have a restraining order, the other party just won't leave them alone. Won't,
Right.
I mean, I've seen situations where somebody has a restraining order and the ex-spouse still shows up and is begging for the relationship and bringing gifts and doing things. And so
right.
I think there's certain
stalking.
behavior. And I don't think we see it always as stalking when we're in that emotional state because we're so desperate to hang on to the relationship sometimes. And this is your spouse. I mean, this is the most intimate person in your life. And now suddenly you're being told you can't
Right.
communicate with them, and it's difficult. But I think sometimes there are people who aren't necessarily intending to harass their spouse. It's just that emotionally they don't have any other way to cope with it, and that's what it ends up looking like.
Right. Yeah. So if you're doing that,
stop.
Cut it out.
Ironically, that's totally. Ironically, if you're chasing somebody, and even if it's not in the form of harassment or verbal and emotional abuse, it doesn't reach that level. If you're chasing your ex-spouse, that's the number one thing that's going to guarantee that you will end up divorced. Because it's just reinforcing for your spouse, oh yeah, I'm making the right decision. This person is nuts. They're driving me nuts. They're chasing me. They're crying. They're whining. They're whatever. And it just reinforces, because there's always we've been told this over and over by therapists and different people, but there's a chaser and a chasee, right? And if you're the chaser, the chasee's running.
Typically, when people divorce, there's drama.
Yeah.
And I think a really good strategy is to do things that kind of throw some water on that. We all fight, and after the breakup, we're looking for vindication, or we're angry, or what have you, and we want to stick our finger in their eye. So
you want to get even.
Yeah. So all of your communications about the kids are drenched in, I know you're never gonna step up to the plate and be a responsible person, but just in case you have a mental lapse and start being a nice guy, I would appreciate being able to change the time of our pickup.
And it's true. That's the type of thing. I mean, that's not a specific one, but it's an amalgamation of things we see, because this is what people do. It's like they throw out barbs and then they expect cooperation.
If you've got kids, you have to communicate. I mean, look, if you're breaking up and you don't have kids and you can divide your property
and go on your way,
yeah,
that's easy.
Nice clean break, you know, go move to a different city and start your new life.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't say it's easy. I know it's still an emotional struggle, but it's easy because you don't have to have ongoing communication with this person. And if you have children with the other person, that person's never truly going away.
Right, yeah.
I'd love to tell you that they are, but I got a kid that's on the brink of 30, and dad's still there, and he's still an ointment in the fly or a fly in the ointment rather, from time to time.
Sometimes the ointment's in the fly.
The fly eats it, I suppose.
But a lot of times we see cases where this kind of gaslighting behavior is going on. Or the person is just in one case very nasty in their communication, or very accusatory, and so what do you do to put the kibosh on that? I mean, you're not a doormat. You don't have to sit there and be insulted, do you?
You don't have to sit and be insulted. No, I mean, this is a hard one because. You don't have to be a doormat, but at the same time, you also don't need to give their comments any value by arguing with them.
Right.
So I think there's a balance there of learning to just not respond to things that are pointless, and I have people say, well, when I'm coaching and working with people, sometimes people say, well, you just want me to let the other person say whatever they want to say. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, you're not going to stop that. They're an individual. They can say whatever they want to say. The thing is that how you react is what is going to determine the outcome.
I think what it boils down to is realizing that you can't control that other person is now outside your jurisdiction.
Yeah. And they're outside the court's jurisdiction in a lot of ways. I mean, honestly, when we start...
Not in a legal sense, but...
Well, but in a lot of ways, not in a legal sense, but their behavior is.
Right.
Because we're going, we feel like we're verbally and emotionally abused by this person. Well, do you want... you have to first understand what constitutes the level of... it's just like with children when people want to call CPS because the other spouse isn't doing A, B, C, or D or whatever. It's like, well, do you understand that what CPS deals with is like children being burned and children being sexually molested and children being, beaten and bruised. And, when you start looking at that's the level, then you start understanding that one parent occasionally losing their temper and yelling and cussing really doesn't rise to that level.
It doesn't.
And I'm not saying it's right for somebody to discipline or treat their child that way. I agree from a parenting perspective.
Or their husband.
I agree from a parenting perspective that it's not right, but it's not. It doesn't reach the level of abuse that would cause the court to intervene in some way.
Realize that you're in control of your own behavior,
Right.
and you're really not in control of his or hers. So the extinguishment strategy means never letting them know that they got to you.
Right.
So your support group and your support system is really important, because sometimes you do need to vent about these things.
Right.
But he is not the person.
Right.
He's not the person to vent
Or she.
to. Yeah, I mean, trying to call them out on their BS is not, it doesn't help anything.
And it's not going to change them. I mean, you would love to think that it would, and you would hope that a crisis like divorce would give people insight. But some people, as you always say, are completely impervious to wisdom. And some people will not change and will not become self-aware no matter what you do, because honestly, I find most of the time it's because they can't handle it emotionally.
Yeah.
They can't handle holding a mirror up and trying to look at their own behaviors. And so if you're dealing with somebody like that, and a lot of times narcissistic people in particular are that way, and if you're dealing with somebody who's like that, the only thing that you can do is insulate yourself from it. And the way you start to insulate yourself is through extinguishment and through drawing those boundaries. If you can draw those boundaries, the extinguishment and all those types of things will work so much better than a restraining order, because what a restraining order usually does is it actually pumps up the volume, right? It pours gasoline on the fire, and it makes the interaction with them, you know, even worse a lot of times, especially if you have somebody who isn't willing to follow the rules or isn't willing to be subject to the court order and all those kinds of things. It can sometimes make it worse. Now, again, I'm not saying that, you know, if you're being abused and your life is in danger and your kid's life is in danger and all that, I'm not suggesting that extinguishment will fix that issue. You need a restraining order. But, you know, we so often see the domestic violence clinic down at the court totally clogged up with people, and I would venture to say 75% of those people are not people that need a restraining order. Mm-hmm. They're people that think that they can either use the restraining order to get back at the other person, they think that it'll help them get an upper hand in their custody case, or they really have no concept of what rises to the level of abuse that the courts are looking for. It's one of those three things. And so, you know, for the vast majority of people that are, you know, feeling like there's verbal and emotional abuse, the extinguishment is the very best approach for it.
If you are living your own life, mm-hmm. if you're getting satisfaction out of your career, your hobbies, your new mate, whatever it is that you've done to move on from this relationship, those things from the other person, they're like rain on a window. They just bounce off.
Yeah, they start to become very insignificant.
So just stop dancing. Don't fire back. Give some a buffer time before you respond.
Yeah, that's a big one because you're emotional.
Yeah. And don't they're not entitled to see, they're not entitled to know how you feel anymore, because
right.
You're not married to them anymore.
Right.
So
yeah.
That's our advice.
We'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands.